Hi, everyone. We're gonna wait a couple more minutes just to let people in. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our webinar, Stronger Together, Revisiting the EU-China Climate Collaboration and Green Development in an Ever-Warming World. I am Alejandro Cordero, member of the events team of European Quanxi and your moderator in this webinar. Today, we will explore the crucial collaboration between the European Union and China on climate change and green development in 3 different sections. The EU and China are 2 major players in the global efforts to combat climate change and promote green development. Like, both parties have made significant commitments to reduce carbon emissions and transition to renewable energy sources. Allow me to introduce our distinguished speaker, Siwat Jawar Barnakomola, using Jawar as a nickname. He will provide insights into the current status of the EU-China collaboration on climate change and green development. We will also discuss the challenges that both parties face in achieving their climate goals and the opportunities for closer collaboration to create a sustainable future for all. We hope that this webinar will spark insightful discussions and contribute to a deeper understanding of the critical role of the EU-China collaboration in addressing this global issue. With no further ado, let's get into it. So in the first section, our speaker will tackle the current state of the EU-China green collaboration in a sort of mini lecture. So please, Siwat, all yours.
Thank you, Alejandro. So I would like to share my screen first. Do you see my screen?
Yes, it is.
Perfect. So let's begin. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I will begin the first quarter of the webinar by providing you all with an overview of the current state of the EU-China collaboration on climate change and green development. First, then we will delve deeper into some specific topics within that collaboration in the second part of the webinar. Okay, so this presentation will proceed in 4 parts. First, we will assess the EU's and China's visions and policies toward a low-carbon future. Then we will examine the current state of EU-China cooperation on climate change and green development before highlighting the challenges that lie ahead. And finally, the presentation will conclude that the collaboration between the EU and China on climate change and green development becomes a crucial driving force to a more sustainable future as the planet's temperature continues to rise. It could be argued that the climate change is now placed at the core of the EU-China 21st century collaboration, as its ramifications have posed a threat to both parties' security. For the past several years, they have not only launched numerous green initiatives, such as the European Green Deal or the EGD, and the BRI International Green Development Coalition or BRIC, but also reiterated their ambitions to mitigate the global climate crisis. This was evident in 2020 when the European Commission and Chinese President Xi Jinping announced the plan to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 and 2060 respectively. Despite that differences in political and economic systems, the EU and China have emerged as key partners in global climate governance. Both of them share the aspiration to mitigate the climate crisis and advance sustainable development at the national and global levels. So let's begin with the EU first. The EU has been spearheading the mitigation of global climate change and the development of international climate agenda for the past decade through global norm establishing and multilateral cooperation. The EU announced the European Green Deal in 2019, aimed at achieving carbon neutrality in 2050. Moreover, the EU further increased its 2030 greenhouse gases emissions reduction targets from 55% in 2021 to 57% in 2022. To facilitate the EU's climate ambitions, the EU initiated the Emissions Trading System, or the ETS, in 2005 to serve as the role model for international emissions trading worldwide. In addition, the EU launched the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanisms, or CBAM, you could say, as a market-based solution to preclude the risk of carbon leakage from countries outside of Europe, which may possess less stringent climate policies. More recently, the EU introduced the Fit for 55 package in 2021 to accelerate emissions reduction in myriad sectors covered in the ETS. This initiative also reinvigorated the Renewable Energy Directive with a commitment to raise the share of renewable energy sources to 40% in final energy consumption by 2030. Thus far, the EU has maintained an outstanding commitment to global climate change with the enforcement of policies and initiatives to drive Europe towards carbon neutrality. Similarly, it has been evident that China becomes the forerunner in dealing with the climate crisis for the past several years. China's visions and strategy are encapsulated in its project to build an ecological civilization. Under this project, China has made significant efforts to promote a green transformation at both national and global levels. President Xi Jinping announced in 2020 that China will strive to become carbon neutral by 2060. Since the 12th five-year plan, China has demonstrated that greenhouse gases emissions reduction and sustainable development are among the top priorities of national development, with a proposed reduction target of over 65% by 2030. Compared to the 2005 level. What is more, China introduced BRIC in 2017 to alleviate the environmental issues resulting from the implementation of the Belt and Road Initiative and foster synergy among partners towards environmental sustainability. The most recent plan is the mid-century long-term low greenhouse gases emission development strategy published in 2021, which serves as China's strategic vision for 2060. And this plan goes beyond emissions reduction to include the likes of blue economy and nature-based solutions to the climate crisis. What this comparison trying to demonstrate is that although the EU and China may differ in their approaches towards decarbonization. They both share the ambition of promoting global climate change mitigation and sustainable development. The year 2020 witnessed both parties declaring their plans to become carbon neutral by 2050 for the EU and 2060 for China. Both the EU and China raised their 2030 targets in their respective nationally determined contributions, or the NDC, to the Paris Agreement in 2022, emphasizing their unwavering efforts to climate action. As a result, the shared goal of heading towards decarbonization between the two top emitters has formed the backbone for their synergistic efforts in a wide range of areas, as will be briefly discussed in the following slides. The EU-China collaboration is now central to global efforts to combat the climate crisis nowadays. The EU-China Strategic Agenda for Cooperation, published in 2013, has laid a solid foundation for their strategic climate partnership. Since then, both polities have been working together on wide-ranging areas, such as the development of renewable energy, green technology, circular economy, ecological conservation, biodiversity, and sustainable city. The prominence of the EU-China collaboration on climate change and green development has been acknowledged by key figures of the two giants. In 2019, Wang Yi, the Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs, contended that the collaboration between China and the EU is essential for combating climate change. Likewise, the ambassador of the delegation of the European Union to China highlighted in 2020 that both parties could make synergistic efforts to address the climate crisis. To date, the EU-China collaboration on climate change and green development takes many forms. These may involve the establishment of a high dialogue mechanism, such as the high-level dialogue on environment and climate and joint initiatives in climate-related fields. Some of them are the EU-China Emissions Trading System Project, or the ETS, which could argue that this project has helped China develop its own carbon trading system. Another is the EU-China Environment Project, which was launched in 2018. Regarding green finance, the co-funding mechanism, or CDM, was jointly established in 2014, which is part of the EU's Horizon 2020 to finance joint climate-related research projects. In terms of energy cooperation, the EU and China initiated the EU-China Near Zero Emission Coal Project in 2006 to jointly advance carbon capture and storage technology. In 2010, both parties further established the Europe-China Clean Energy Center, aimed at promoting renewable energy development through innovation, collaboration, and technical assistance. As has been demonstrated, the EU and China have a long history of collaboration on a wide range of climate-related topics, moving together towards a low-carbon future. This, in turn, emphasizes that two giants can work together in mitigating the climate crisis and steering sustainable development globally. However, their collaboration might be impacted by some challenges resulting from the intensification of both parties' climate ambitions for years to come. Although recent years have demonstrated lively EU-China collaboration on global climate change and green development, there are several challenges that would potentially disrupt it. The most pressing challenge centers around growing economic competition in the renewable energy sector. China has become dominant in the global solar and wind energy markets, and its capacity and competitiveness in the climate-related sectors have expanded exponentially over the past few years. This rising Chinese competitiveness in the global market has sometimes resulted in unintended confrontations with the EU. For instance, the trade confrontation over solar panels in 2013. Although the friction over solar panels was settled in 2017, the conflict over bilateral trade continues to arise, which can be seen in the wind segment. Reading between the lines, what seems underlying in this challenge is that the dynamic of EU-China collaboration on climate change and green development seems inseparable from the wider geo-economic reality between the two polities. And we will delve deeper into this topic in the second part of the webinar. Although tensions do occur, it remains indisputable that the cooperation between China and the EU, the two among the largest emitters, will remain quintessential for the world to move toward a low carbon future in the coming years. As the global temperature continues to rise, the synergy between the EU and China in addressing climate change becomes a vital driving force to a more sustainable future. Although economic competition and geopolitical tensions do exist in their relations, both parties have demonstrated a growing willingness to cooperate when it comes to further advancing the international climate agenda. Looking to the future, the lively partnership could not only inspire countries worldwide to head towards decarbonization in the coming decade, but also determine if the Paris Agreement's goals could be reached. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your very well elaborated presentation. If you can just stop the sharing. Yeah, thank you very much, Siva. So we will now for the second section. In this second section, I have prepared some specific questions for our speaker to answer regarding relevant aspects of this topic. So for the first question, understanding priorities in the international cooperation can help to identify areas where both parties can work together more effectively. In this case, to achieve their climate goals and create a sustainable future. What do you see as the current priorities for collaboration between the EU and China in the realm of green development, and how have these priorities evolved over time?
Thank you for the questions, Alejandro. I touched upon some of them in the previous presentation, and we will now explore these priorities for collaboration between the EU and China more extensively. Within the domain of green development, the EU and China have been working together on 5 principal areas. These include climate change mitigation, energy transition to renewable energy, circular economy, sustainable finance, and sustainable urban development. As for the first key priority, climate change mitigation is now central to the synergy between both policies. This could be seen from the fact that China and the EU have been demonstrating their increasing climate ambitions for the past few years, and that they both launched a number of joint projects to address the climate crisis, such as the EU-China ETS project, as well as climate change-related issues. In this regard, the high-level dialogue continues to be the main platform for the EU and China to stress their willingness to work together on the mitigation of climate change. In the EU-China summit last year, both polities agreed to continue their collaboration on climate change and green development. This cooperation was further reinforced during the 3rd high-level environment and climate dialogue held on the 8th of July, where both China and the EU committed to deepening their cooperation in the fields of environment, climate, and energy. In facilitating both the EU's and China's pursuit of a low-carbon future, they have also been cooperating on the development and deployment of renewable energy, energy efficiency, and green technology. There has been a growing alignment and agreement on the goals of transforming energy systems. The EU and China have both implemented energy policies that aimed to reduce emissions, enhance the energy efficiency, and facilitate a transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources. Consequently, these energy policies have brought results. According to 2023 European Electricity Review released by Amber think tank, solar and wind power generated greater than a fifth of the EU's electricity in 2022, overtaking fossil gas for the first time. On the Chinese side, China is now home to over 30% of the world's renewable power capacity. In the first half of 2022, China's rise in wind and solar generation was 37% and 38% of the total global increase in wind and solar generation, respectively. The annual dialogue for energy cooperation between China and the EU has been held since 1994, and this was reinforced by the EU-China Roadmap for Energy Cooperation in 2016, including the subsequent 2018 joint statement on climate change and clean energy. That energy cooperation was further deepened by the joint statement on the implementation of the EU-China energy cooperation in 2019. One of the most successful outcomes is the establishment of the EU-China energy cooperation platforms in the same year, which aim to enhance cooperation and help increase mutual trust and understanding between both parties and contribute to a global transition and global emissions towards clean energy. The most recent EU-China Energy Dialogue, which was held in March 2022 via video conference, addressed the topics of the green transition and the electricity market reform. Within the same year, the Working Conference on the EU-China Hydrogen Energy Cooperation has been held to review the achievements China-EU Hydrogen Energy Innovation Cooperation made so far, and to emphasize the importance of collaboration between both parties in the field of hydrogen energy. All these series of dialogue between both polities demonstrate how the energy transition to clean energy is one of the key priorities in the EU-China collaboration. However, this area is also becoming a potential area for competition and confrontation, as will be discussed later. The third key priority for the EU-China collaboration on green development is the development of circular economy. In a general sense, the circular economy is an economic model that aims to minimize waste and maximize the use of resources. Products and materials are kept in use for as long as possible, and waste is minimized by designing products and production processes to be regenerative and restorative. Both China and the EU have sought to advance this form of economy to further achieve their goals of resource efficiency and sustainable development. While China showed this ambition in the likes of the Zero Waste City projects, the EU expressed this through the adoption of a Closing the Loop package, which is the EU's action plan for the circular economy. More importantly, both parties signed the Memorandum of Understanding on Circular Economy in 2018 in order to highlight the importance of both parties jointly developing the circular economy. Under this MOU, the EU and China agreed to cooperate on dialogue on the design, planning, and implementation of strategies in the fields of mutual interest. Moreover, the areas of cooperation include strategic exchanges on management systems such as eco-design and eco-labeling, as well as on best practices on circular economy in key fields such as plastics and waste. This joint ambition could be seen in early 2020 when China and the EU supported the event called the EU-China Collaboration Dialogue in Circular Economy in Cities, organized by collaboration between the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and the China Associations on Circular Economy. This dialogue brought together key stakeholders from both Europe and China to showcase their plans for a circular economy and explore solutions to common challenges. Although the collaboration between the EU and China on this field remains in the initial phase, it becomes an opportunity for both polities to further strengthen their relations as well as achieve their own resource efficiency and emissions reduction objectives. The fourth key area of the EU-China collaboration on green development lies in sustainable finance. For the past few years, the EU and China have created several funding mechanisms to finance numerous collaborative projects on climate change and green development. For example, as mentioned earlier, the co-funding mechanism or CDM was jointly established in 2014, which is part of the EU's Horizon 2020 to finance joint climate research related projects. On top of that, the People's Bank of China and the European Investment Bank announced a joint initiative to buttress the framework for green investment in 2017. This project has developed a framework for analysis and decision-making in green finance for both parties. Then in 2019, the International Platform on Sustainable Finance was established, which was spearheaded by the People's Bank of China and the European Commission. One of the outcomes was that the EU and China agreed to jointly deliver the financing needed to achieve the energy transition. As such, the continued collaboration between EU and China on sustainable finance is essential for achieving the shared goal of decarbonization in the long term. Last but not least, the development of a sustainable city is also the key priority of the EU-China collaboration on climate change and green development. Sustainable urban development refers to the creation of cities that are livable, equitable, and environmental friendly. It also involves developing cities that can support economic growth and environmental sustainability. The EU-China collaboration on this matter was grounded in the EU-China Urbanization Partnership, which was initiated in 2012. The partnership aims to provide both parties with spaces to work together in the fields of urbanization and sustainable development. Therefore, the partnership prioritized the development of smart, green, and inclusive cities. One of the highlighted projects is the Europe-China Eco-Cities Link, or the EC Link, which was completed in 2020. The project obtained high-level government endorsement in both Europe and China as part of the EU-China partnership on urbanization. Some success stories of this project could be seen in Qingdao City, where the EC Link helped facilitate the comprehensive energy efficient improvement project for existing buildings. In conclusion, the topics of climate mitigation, energy transition to renewable energy, circular economy, sustainable finance, and sustainable urban development have been the central areas of collaboration between China and the EU over the past years. The importance of this partnership in these domains remains prominent as it not only reinforces the wider EU-China relations, but also facilitates meaningful global efforts towards decarbonization in the coming decades. I hope this answers your question.
Yes, of course. Thank you for your complete answer. So going for the second question, actually successful joint projects in the EU-China green collaboration, like the ones you said, have the potential to bring about positive outcomes, like including reduced carbon emissions and increased the use of renewable energy sources. What are some other examples of successful joint projects in the EU-China green collaboration, and what are that positive outcomes they have achieved? Additionally, what are some of the challenges towards a more sustainable future?
Wow, that's interesting question. And thank you for the questions again, Alejandro. I will try to outline some examples of successful joint projects between the EU and China first, before we move on to the challenges that both parties may face in the future. To begin with, the collaboration between the EU and China has resulted in numerous successful joint initiatives in green development. Two noteworthy projects are worth mentioning for their contribution to the EU, China, and the world. One of them is the EU-China Emissions Trading System, or the ETS project, which spanned from 2014 to 2017. The project enabled the EU to exchange its strategies with the 7 pilot emissions trading areas in China, facilitating the development of a market, monitoring, reporting, verification, and certification mechanisms that facilitate the implementation of China's carbon trading system. Moreover, China benefited from the project in terms of capacity building as well. Recent study indicates that joint seminars and training sessions have been hosted in several provinces and cities in China. Therefore, it also has enabled Chinese experts and stakeholders to learn from the past experiences of the successful EU ETS, which allows China to move ahead to construct its own emissions trading system that suits its own circumstances. Subsequently, the successful first phase of the EU-China ETS paved the way for the second phase, which spanned from 2017 to 2020. As a result, this collaborative project has not only brought about positive development to the China's carbon trading system, but also led to a relative reduction of greenhouse gases emissions worldwide. In 2021, China released its newly national ETS, which is now the largest carbon market in the world, 3 times larger than Europe. In July 2022, China's ETS marked its first anniversary of trading, according to China Dialogue. During this time, the market had traded almost 200 million tons of carbon emission allowances, valued at over $1 billion. During the first compliance cycle, over 2,000 power companies had a compliance rate of over 99%. These achievements can be attributed to the successful implementation of China's ETS, which was made possible through strong and unwavering cooperation between the EU and China on this matter. Currently, advisors within China ETS have initiated the drafting of long-term plans that involve connecting China's ETS with other countries worldwide, particularly with the European ETS. If succeeded, a linked China-EU ETS could serve as a milestone for the global efforts to mitigate the climate crisis and move towards decarbonization. Another successful example is the EU-China Environment and Green Economy Program, or the EU-China Environmental Project, launched in 2018. The project is presently in the second phase, spanning from 2021 to 2024. Its objectives is to enhance the EU-China environmental cooperation, raise environmental protection standards, increase environmental governance, alignment, and integrate the environment to other government decision-making areas. Under this project, the EU and China will jointly undertake policy studies and organize workshops, seminars, and exchanges on the topics of climate change and green development. Success stories of this project take the forms of a series of exchange activities on environmental protection and green economy. It also produced an in-depth study on integrated environmental policies for a green economy, focusing on how to ensure the integration of environmental policies and integrating environmental consideration into broader economic policies, planning, and legislation. All in all, these examples of successful joint projects between the EU and China not only demonstrate a strong partnership between the two parties, but also contribute to the global efforts to combat climate crisis and achieve a low carbon future. Nevertheless, there are three main challenges that to some extent might hinder further collaboration between the EU and China in the realm of green development. These challenges center around the geopolitical and geoeconomic realities of the two giants. The first challenge lies in the rising competitiveness of China in the global renewable energy sector for the past several years. As mentioned earlier, China has become dominant in the global solar and wind energy markets, and its capacity and competitiveness in the climate-related sectors have grown substantially over the past few years, resulting in unintended confrontations with the EU sometimes. A good example is the trade friction over solar panels in 2013. The EU accused China of dumping its solar panels on the European markets at the prices below their fair value, which led to the EU imposing anti-dumping and anti-subsidy investigations on China's solar panel imports. This conflict was completely settled in 2017. Likewise, in the wind sector, 7 Chinese companies are now among the top 15 manufacturers of wind turbines globally, while the former European market leaders risk losing a significant portion of their market share. Another key challenge centers around divergent views between the EU and China on the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or the CBAM. As expected to enforce on polluting goods from 2026, CBAM will require companies importing carbon-intensive products such as steel into the EU to pay for their carbon emissions at the border. While the EU views this mechanism as an effective tool to prevent carbon leakage and to encourage companies outside the EU to minimize their carbon footprint, some of these Chinese policymakers perceive CBAM as the EU's protectionist and discriminatory policy, which may lead to trade friction. This was evident in 2021 when the Chinese spokesman of the Ministry of Ecology and Environment commented that CBAM is essentially a unilateral measure to extend the climate change issue to the trade sector and seriously undermine mutual trust in the global community, quote unquote. More recently, in March 2023, China's World Trade Organization envoy proposed using the Committee on Trade and Environment to discuss controversial environmental measures, starting with CBAM, and which China has claimed that CBAM is non-compliant with the WTO's rules. The reason for this might be that the tariff would have a ripple effect on China's development, as China is among the world's top producer of industrial raw materials. Although the actual effect of CBAM on China has not fully yet to be known, this conflicting view could derail the EU's and China's joint efforts to tackle the climate crisis to a certain extent. All things considered, the EU and China face challenges hindering further collaboration in green development, including the rising competitiveness of China in renewable energy and divergent views on the EU CBAM. While China's success in the renewable energy sector has made it a fierce competitor, the EU CBAM may clash with China's interests. These challenges resonate the fact that the EU-China collaboration on green development seems inseparable from the wider geopolitical and geoeconomic realities of both parties. Against this backdrop, the fact remains that a robust partnership between the EU and China on green development is essential for the global efforts to combat climate crisis and steer sustainable development for decades to come. And that's my answer to your questions.
Thank you very much, Siva. And so for the third question, actually, we're gonna go more into like the real work of the actors in here. So the private and the public sectors have like an essential role to play in this collaboration. The private sector can invest in green technologies and innovation, while the public sector can establish policies and regulation that encourage environmentally friendly practices. So what are the key roles of the private and public sectors in the EU-China green collaboration? And how can the international institutions help strengthen their synergy to promote that sustainable development?
Sure. Thank you for the questions, Alejandro. This topic is important to get a deeper understanding of the EU-China collaboration on green development, although the companies, whether private or state-owned, the public and international institutions have played a crucial role in promoting the EU-China cooperation in this realm. They are sometimes neglected in the study of the EU-China collaboration on green development. First of all, both European and Chinese companies have been actively engaging in green development over the past years by upholding sustainable practices, reducing emissions, and investing in development of clean energy and green technologies. On the EU side, for example, Total Energies, a French multinational energy company, released its latest sustainability and climate progress report, indicating that the company's ambition to become one of the world's top 5 producers of solar and wind energy by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. Meanwhile, Tencent Holdings, a Chinese multinational conglomerate, has set its goal to become carbon neutral by 2030 across its operations and supply chain. In this regard, both the European and Chinese companies have acknowledged the potential benefits of cooperation in promoting green development, which in turn will support the tenets of the European Green Deal and China's ecological civilization. Therefore, in recent years, there has been an increasing partnership between European and Chinese companies to invest in renewable energy and green technologies. For example, in 2016, Enel, an Italian energy multinational, and BYD, a leading electric vehicle manufacturer from China, signed a global framework cooperation agreement to jointly promote the electrification of public transport and leverage the technological solutions developed by both companies on vehicle charging and electric mobility. As a result of their partnership, Enel established Enel X in China in 2020 to supply equipment for powering China's charging infrastructure, system, and management software platform for electric vehicles. Another example is the collaboration between Volkswagen, a major German automobile manufacturer, and a Chinese lithium-ion batteries manufacturer, Goshen High-Tech. In May 2020, both companies entered a strategic cooperation framework by signing an MOU to industrialize battery cell production at Volkswagen Group Components, Sochi site. and to develop first use cases of Volkswagen Unified Cell concept for the volume segment. The two projects are part of Volkswagen plan to reduce batteries, complexity, and expenses while increasing range and charging capabilities in order to make electric cars more appealing. Consequently, the collaboration between the two companies would support the goals of becoming carbon neutral by 2050. In fact, there are many more examples of the collaboration between European and Chinese companies in the domain of green development, as seen from the partnership between EDF Energy and China General Nuclear Power Corporation on the Hinkley Point C nuclear project in the UK. The two examples mentioned earlier have demonstrated the role played by companies from both parties in the collaboration between the EU and China, and therefore this partnership has the potential to further enhance the EU-China collaboration on green development. What I would like to highlight further is the role of the public, which also has considerable contributions to the EU-China collaboration on green development, although their role seems to be overlooked in the study of EU-China green collaboration. The term public here may involve individuals, communities, civil societies, and other groups that may not be affiliated with the governments, but are instead committed to advancing sustainability and environmental protection through activism, cooperation, and other means. What I would like to note here is the prominent role of the EU's and China's civil societies. Both sides have been working together through various joint platforms provided by the EU-China cooperation, such as the EU-China NGO Training Program, the EU-China Civil Society Forum, EU-China Europa Forum, and the EU-China NGO Program. For example, according to 2019 EU-China Training Program report, over 20 organizations across China and Europe gathered to work together on the overarching fields of low carbon development and social and environmental justice. An example of this is the cooperation between Yunnan Green Environment Development Foundation and the Berlin-based Gender CC. They together hosted various knowledge sharing activities and support projects related to the gender and climate change. Another example would be the China-Europe Forum, founded in 2005 as part of the EU-China Partnership on Urbanization. The organization has held a series of workshops addressing the various aspects of the transition towards sustainable cities in Brussels, Paris, Shanghai, and Guangzhou since 2012. As has been demonstrated, the public also helped foster the wider EU-China collaboration on green development to a certain extent. Finally, the international institutions like the World Bank and the UN programs, such as the UNDP and UNEP, have played an important part in promoting a comprehensive collaboration between the EU and China in the field of green development. This has taken the forms of financial support for several green development projects in both the EU and China, facilitating knowledge sharing and capacity building efforts between the two polities, and helping to facilitate dialogue between both parties on environmental issues. For example, in 2019, the World Bank's Board of Executive Directors approved a $300 million loan for the China Renewable Energy Battery Storage Promotion Project to increase the integration and utilization of renewable energy by deploying battery storage system at scale. Moreover, in the same year, the UNDP and the China Development Bank agreed to collaborate on promoting sustainable finance and investment projects aimed at advancing the sustainable development goals and combating the global climate crisis. Furthermore, the mediating role of World Trade Organization in the 2010 EU and China's trade dispute over solar panels should also be noted. Without the help from the WTO, the dispute would have a profound impact on the EU-China collaboration on green development, as well as their wider relations. To conclude, there is no denying that the private and state-owned companies, along with the public and international institutions, have played a crucial role in promoting cooperation between the EU and China in the field of green development, and they remain prominent in fostering the EU-China synergy for years to come. I hope this answers your questions, and sorry for the time.
That's totally right. Thank you very much. So as we can see, there are strong bonds beyond the political and always sensational aspects. We will now proceed to the third part of this webinar, the Q&A session. Some of you have made very interesting questions, first of all, but to respond. But since we are running out of time, we will have to choose some of them.
Okay,
so
sure.
For the first question, I think this one can also somehow answer the Lucrezia's question in our chat. So as you might have heard, the influence of China-born concept of ecological civilization in the current international system is significant, as it can imply the change of the international climate action leadership at the expense of the European Union as a normative power. So how do you think the development and understanding of this concept in the academic and political scope is going to affect the international system in general, and the EU-China relationship in specific, and to what extent?
Yes, thank you for the questions, Alejandro. That was an interesting question, but please allow me to have some time to think about it. Well, the concept of ecological civilization emphasizes the importance of balancing economic development and environmental conservation. For the past few years, we may recognize that China has promoted this concept at both national and global levels, and the ecological civilization seems similar to the principles of European Green Deal and its underlying objectives of moving towards sustainability seem to share with the long-standing EU's green ambitions. From my perspective, the development and the understanding of China's ecological civilization concept in the academic and political scope could have significant implications for the international system and the EU-China relationship. In terms of the implication for the international system, one potential impact of this concept is the shift in international climate leadership. As China continues to promote its concept of ecological civilization, it may gain credibility and influence in the global community on issues related to climate change and environmental protection. Therefore, China may be increasingly perceived by the global community as the global environmental leader or the global climate leader. This could directly challenge the long-standing EU position as a normative power in this field, triggering a shift in the international climate leadership. And to some extent, this might be true if we consider the fact that China is now dominant in global renewable energy markets, and that China emphasizes its ambitions to achieve peak emissions in 2030 and carbon neutrality in 2060. However, it seems to me that the shift is unlikely to occur in the coming years. It may take perhaps a long time. This is because the Chinese climate leadership have proven to be contentious up to the present compared to the EU that has been consistently active in this field. Within China, an example would be China's post-pandemic recovery policies, which were mostly industry-led. In September 2020, I would say, the Chinese province of Hubei announced the plan to invest 90 billion yuan in coal, electricity, oil and gas sectors up until 2023. The following month saw the operation of 5.6 billion yuan coal power plant in Guizhou. This industry-led economic recovery has stimulated demand for coal, oil, and natural gas above the pre-pandemic period. As a result, carbon emissions from the three major types of fossil fuels all rose in 2020. Moreover, although China is the world's biggest investor in renewable energy, the nation's energy investment abroad or overseas are mainly fossil fuels. A study published in 2022 indicates that the proportion of renewables in China's power generation investment is 77% domestically, while only 22% overseas. With the support of Chinese development banks and state subsidies, Chinese companies are still making massive investments in coal-fired power plants in Central Asia, Eastern Europe, Africa, and Latin America. According to a recent study, 70% of all the coal-fired power plants outside China are financed by Chinese banks, and China's coal power investment in BRI countries is primarily funded by China's public banks and export credit agencies. This is problematic, because it increases the emissions in countries elsewhere outside China. As a result, this could undermine those countries' efforts to achieve the transition towards decarbonization as well. In effect, this fact seems to undermine China's global representation of climate or environmental leader to some extent. In terms of implication for EU-China relationship, the concept of ecological civilization could contribute to both a closer collaboration and competition between China and the EU on issues related to climate change and green development, as discussed throughout the webinar. The potential conflicts may occur when the EU perceives that China is trying to challenge its long-standing climate leadership, and when the EU imposes a carbon tariff on the imports of Chinese carbon-intensive goods. However, I would argue that the EU and China will choose to collaborate more than compete, as the collaboration between them would benefit both parties and the world, while the competition would lead to a kind of zero-sum game, like one gains, one loses. To wrap up my answer, it seems to me that the development and understanding of China's ecological civilization have significant implications for the international system and the EU-China's relationship in particular. Although there might be a shift in climate leadership in the international system away from the EU, this shift is far from likely to occur in the near future. And for an EU-China relationship in particular, the concept of ecological civilization would lead to both cooperation and competition between both parties, but they maybe opt for collaboration as it will benefit all parties. And I am hoping that I have answered your question.
Yeah, that's super great. We actually have 1 minute left, and I would like to answer just very shortly just this question. Like, given that Chinese society is becoming increasingly vocal regarding environmental issues, to what extent do these internal pressures motivate Chinese environmental policy? Like, do they have an impact on EU-China climate collaboration? This is a question that we have in the chat. And if you can, like, very shortly, just give some insight.
Sure, but could you repeat the question a little more slowly, please?
Sorry?
Oh, could you please repeat the question a little more slowly, please?
Yes. So it's, given that Chinese society is becoming increasingly vocal regarding environmental issues, to what extent do these internal pressures motivate Chinese environmental policy? Do they have an impact on EU-China climate collaboration? Like, the Chinese society is becoming increasingly vocal in regarding.
Yes, they do have the impacts on China's and the EU climate collaboration, and they do have the impact on China's environmental policies as well. Because, like, I think the central role of the public in, like, addressing climate crisis and to become, like, more vocal in the Chinese society could steer the positive outcomes in the China's climate policies, and to some extent, it could steer and support the EU and China climate collaboration in a larger extent.
Yeah, that's great, thank. So I would like to publicly thank our standing speaker for enlightening us today with his time and for sharing his expertise. Thank you, Jaguar, thank you. And we thank everybody, all the viewers.